Broadcasting live from Forward Observer Central Command in Austin, Texas. It's the man always out front on issues. You're listening to Out Front with Mike Shelby.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Out Front. I am your host, Mike Shelby. It's good to see everyone back. Today, this is a very, very important message. I feel like most days I try to talk about very important things, but some of the logical conclusions that I've taken away from this book. By the way, this book is The Great Awakening versus the Great Reset by Alexander Dugan. Some of these takeaways, I think, have been very strategically important. On yesterday's show, we talked a little bit about the ideological foundations of Alexander Dugan. He's allegedly the strategic thinker behind Vladimir Putin and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. If that is true, then what's going on in Ukraine is actually much, much larger. And I think we're beginning to see that as the world is drawing lines between the East and West. This, for a long time, these economists and big finance people talked about decoupling from China. I think Russia is accelerating that process as a part of what Alexander Dugan calls the Great Awakening, which means Ukraine is just the first step. Dugan, going back to yesterday briefly, Dugan argues for collectivism, mainly collectivism around the family and tribe, common religion, the nation, the church as well. And he argues that the West, in their effort to shun forms of collectivism, such as communism, have become too individualistic. And that's now being exploited by the globalists who are trying to force individualism in not only in the United States, but on the West and other countries as well. And Dugan really drives this point home. And I think it's the very first chapter. He starts talking about changes in Europe, post-Renaissance changes to European society. And I'll just read you this quote briefly. Quote, the bourgeoisie supplanted all other strata in European society, but the bourgeoisie was exactly the best individual, a citizen without clan, tribe, or profession, but with private property. And this new class began to reconstruct all of European society, end quote. In effectively what he's saying, and Dugan he kind of criticizes capitalism. Now, I'm an unfettered capitalist, proudly, I will say that. His criticism of capitalism is that money under the capitalist system, money begins to supplant the nation, right? The importance of money, especially at the supranational level, when capitalism becomes globalist in nature, then you get society. Money tends to undermine the health of a society, and we can see that with globalization, specifically shipping American jobs overseas. That's capitalism, but to the detriment of the nation. So I think he actually has some kind of valid criticisms on that point. What I'm reminded of when I'm reading this book by Alexander Dugan is another book called Political Tribes. It's by Amy Chua. It's a fantastic book, and she talks about identity politics. And when we read about Dugan's criticism of individualism, we're really looking at identity politics. There's a really good article. It was in the March and April of 2019 edition of Foreign Affairs magazine, and that's a magazine that's put out by the Council on Foreign Relations. Well, they had the second article in the magazine is called The Importance of Elsewhere. And the author talks about somewheres versus anywheres. And the somewheres, the people who are from somewhere, okay, the somewheres, they have roots. They have a hometown. They probably still live there. Their identity is tied to that place. Their fifth or sixth or 10th generation, whatever's from that place. They are tend to not be upwardly mobile. They're not geographically mobile either. They are well established. They have no desire to leave. That is their home. The somewheres are from somewhere, and that's their home. Okay, in this case, that would be the nationalist. And then you have more of they call them the kind of cosmopolitan elite, but the anywheres, and these would be the globalists. These people have college degrees. They're upwardly and geographically mobile. They can feel just as at home in Dallas as they do Miami or San Francisco or LA or New York. They are not tied to somewhere. They can live anywhere. And this becomes a part of their identity and their belonging as well. Anywhere belongs to anyone, and somewhere belongs to someone. And I think this is a really good depiction of nationalists versus globalists. The borderless cosmopolitan elite. That's the globalist. That's what we're talking about here. That's what Dugan is talking about in this book. This is also this cosmopolitan kind of debate. That's not just the crux of our ongoing culture war, because here domestically, we have new America versus old America. We have anywheres versus somewheres here in the United States. And then we also have that on a global level, which is what this book is about. Now, in the second half, this is a short book. It's really kind of an essay, but Dugan outlines his response to the Great Reset. He calls it the Great Awakening. And Dugan is careful to explain that the Great Awakening really hasn't even begun yet. This book, by the way, was published in 2021. I want to say like November of 2021. So it's a relatively book. He says the Great Awakening has not even started. And as a matter of fact, the world is unprepared. The Great Awakening proponents are unprepared to carry out the Great Awakening. Now, the rest of today's show is going to be focused on what Dugan's Great Awakening is. After yesterday, we covered his kind of ideological basics here. One of the problems that Dugan says that we have right now on the anti-globalist side is that so many people are insulated through nationalism, right? Because they're American nationalists and they're Russian nationalists and they're X, Y, or Z country nationalists. And that tends to build barriers. When he says what they actually should be doing is realizing that they may have different nationalities. They're all anti-globalist. They're anti-globalist movements in a lot of countries, he says. And later on in the book, he talks about this big alliance, which I'll talk about later. But he calls this the international. He says there's a globalist international, like there's international globalist movements, and there's also international anti-globalist movements. And he says you really have to have an international effort among anti-globalists to defeat globalism. And so that's one of the things he talks about in the East and the West. He says that a unipolar world, which we have had and which the West is fighting to retain, all this stuff about global NATO, that's to protect the unipolar world where the West, particularly the United States, has most of the power and influence in the world. And that just happens to be the globalist side. Dugan effectively says Russia has to force a multipolar world because that is what's going to break the back of the unipolar globalist world, the globalist goals. So that's kind of also a core tenet here of this Great Awakening, which is why he's trying to reach more audiences internationally. He calls this humanity's revolt against globalism. This is the Great Awakening. He spends a good part of the book explaining this battle between the human collective and the globalists' end goal for humanity. And, 10, 20 years ago, this would have been absolutely insane. But he talks about, but today you read it and you're like, yeah, actually, he's probably not far off. He talks about the end goal for humanity for these globalists is a human machine hybrid singularity. And he's talking about essentially the replacement of the human race with these new entities. And again, 20 years ago, that's just bat stuff crazy. And today with artificial intelligence and Elon Musk's Neuralink and all these other companies talking about implanting chips into into humans' brains, it's actually like, yeah, that's going to be a reality for humans in the next, I think they're already trying to do trials. Actually, Elon Musk's company Neuralink, I forget how many monkeys this is. I posted on Twitter the other day. If I were to join an extremist group, I'd probably go join like the Animal Liberation Front or something like that. But Neuralink has killed don't quote me on this. I want to say it's like a dozen monkeys because they've been doing these animal testing, putting these Neuralink chips into the brains of these monkeys, and they've killed them because they get infections or they get some kind of weird. It's been a while since I read the article, but at any rate, they've had to euthanize these monkeys because they're no longer viable for living once they put these chips in the brain. So they're still doing a lot of testing. I don't know how much longer it's going to be, but the point is, humans are going to have chips and stuff in their brain, and we are going to be a human machine hybrid before too long. Alexander Dugan basically calls this evil. He says this is a war on humanity. This is the globalist war on humanity, and the Great Awakening is humanity's response. Now, if this is starting to sound a little bit like Alex Jones, Dugan actually does bring him up in chapter 4. And Alex Jones has been talking about this for a long time. He's been railing against globalism since I started listening to Alex Jones in probably the maybe mid 2000s. And this is actually one area where Alex Jones is right. Now, Dugan sees a foothold. Dugan's very optimistic about the pro-Trump movement in the United States. And he says, Trumpism will outlive Trump. And he says, look, you got 70 million Trump voters, 70 million anti-globalists in the United States. And that's rough math, but I think it's fairly accurate. And so he's optimistic now that Trumpism can remain a political force in the United States, that American nationalism can remain a global force in the fight against globalism. And he's basically saying one reason why it's so important for the globalists to retain power by hook or crook in the United States is because if the United States turns anti-globalist, then it will be a pretty stunning defeat. I mean, that'll be a major. Trump was a major loss for the globalist effort. Actually, he calls it a setback, a globalist failure multiple times throughout the book. And when we come back to the culture war, low intensity conflict, Civil War 2.0, whatever you want to call it, this kind of is the fight for what America is going to be, new America or old America. Is the United States going to return to its limited government roots, or is it going to be? Are we going to continue to fight the globalists and bankers' wars? That is going to be determined by this conflict, which I think has already started and is going to get much worse this decade. Going back to the book, Dugan says that European populists have to establish a pole in this multipolar world. He basically says, look, the right-wing and left-wing populists who are both anti-globalists need to come together in Europe and build an anti-globalist pole along with China. China also needs to have an anti-globalist pole in this unipolar world. He does caution that China cannot take over the anti-globalist movement. China plays a role, but they are not the anti-globalist movement. He also says the Islamic world also needs to be share a role in this multipolar world against globalism, because he says, look, both China and the Islamic world, they are traditional societies. They're anti-globalist societies. As a matter of fact, here, I'll share with you this quote. He says, quote, Chinese civilization is the triumph of clan, folk, order, and structure over all individuality, end quote. Now, in the back of this book, Dugan comes out and says, Russia has to be at the forefront of this anti-globalist war. By the way, I'll come back and read through your comments and find some questions at the end of the show. But he says Russia has to be at the forefront of the Great Awakening. He says that Russia is the heir of two collapsed empires, the heir of the Byzantine Empire and the heir of the Mongol Empire. And he says Russia is just naturally an imperial state, and Russia has to return to this imperial state so they can build themselves an economic and cultural pole in this new multipolar world. Ultimately, the Great Awakening means fulfilling the promise of this new Russian empire and a return of an imperial Russia, which we are seeing not just in Ukraine, but also in Syria, in Georgia, South Ossetia, Abkhazia. You may recall back in, I think it was 2008, I want to say, they went into Georgia. And so Ukraine, by this argument, Ukraine can't be the last Russian military incursion we see. As a matter of fact, there is some speculation that Belarus is about to have some large military exercise, and there's some speculation that Belarus is actually using this military exercise to join the fight. And there are a couple of folks saying that instead of having Victory Day on May 9th be the end of Russia's military objectives in Ukraine, it's really going to be an expansion of Russia's goals throughout the regions. But we'll cover more on that in Forward Observer this week. Back to the book. Dugan says when you understand Dugan's multipolar argument that you have to have a multipolar world to break the back of the globalist unipolar goals, because under the unipolar world you have centralized authority, and having multipolar world means other countries get a say. Other countries, anti-globalist countries, also get a say. And he says this is the only way you're going to beat globalism. And this process, it was not underway when he wrote this book. Post-Ukraine, it is underway. And this is going to be a very painful process for Americans, but I think a necessary one. And once you understand this, it makes a lot more sense. And what I'm about to say is going to be controversial to many of you. However, it needs to be said. I've come to the conclusion that if you are fighting on the side of the United States in World War III, whether that's a Cold War or a hot war, if this does lead to World War III, fighting for the United States means defending globalism. It means defeating other countries to advance globalism. It means fighting on the side of the globalists and advancing their centralized unipolar world. The defense of the West right now, today, unfortunately, I think this is true. The defense of the West today means defending the globalist status quo. What Dugan sees on the other side of this is an alliance of illiberal anti-globalists. So the Trump movement in the United States, both left and right-wing populism in Europe, the Islamic world, countries in Latin America, such as Brazil. He even talks about Africa being decolonized and these decolonized African countries being part of the anti-globalist coalition here. And then Russia, and of course you have China. Dugan writes, here's another quote, instead of the dominance of one single globalist empire of the Great Reset, the Russian awakening should be the beginning of an era of many empires, reflecting and embodying the richness of human cultures, traditions, religions, and value systems. He, in effect, is saying you have to have many nationalities. You have to have many empires. And that is the only way you're going to protect against the globalist movement, which is why we see the globalists talk about living in a borderless world and the Great Reset. You know, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. You'll be completely dependent on the system. That's what enables globalism. And he actually talks about how technology, our dependence on technology, on phones and computers and all the things we use every single day is actually only increasing our dependency on the globalist system, because who runs all these tech companies? They're all globalists. All right. So that's going to do it for the end of, and by the way, I'll read your comments and take some questions if you have some, but that's the end of my kind of synopsis of the Great Awakening versus the Great Reset. It's an interesting read, and it does kind of reframe. See, here in the United States, we get heavily filtered messaging, and it's very important to read the works of foreign authors because they don't have an American-centric view. Their view of the world is not covered by, or is not colored by, American lenses. Very, very important. All right, Dustin, if you can help me, please try to find some questions. We'll go ahead and open up. On the topic of WEF, the World Economic Forum, can you imagine being on the side of Joe Biden, George Soros, and Klaus Schwab? These, by some, apparently these people are held as heroes, but they are clearly, very clearly, the villains in this situation. Yeah, I see some people talking about Putin has always only ever been about Putin, and that may be true. I think he's probably a kleptocrat like the rest of them. However, I'm reminded back in the mid 2010s, there was a Russian Orthodox priest that he was asked why he supports Putin. And he said, well, I support Putin because he's the only man standing between westernization of Russia. And he talked about gay pride parades and kind of the moral decay and the decadence of the West. We're so wealthy. It's affecting our morality. It's degrading our society. He said, if Putin were not in charge, that same thing would be happening to Russia. And I think that's also a valid point. I think that's an interesting point. And I mean, I'm not a Putin apologist. I'm certainly not defending Vladimir Putin. However, I do think there is an element of truth in that. All right. Oh, sorry, Dustin. I think you had a question over here. Moldova may be about to go get military support from the EU, possible escalation in Transnistria, and expansion of proxy war. Yeah, actually, Dust, over on the early warning report. By the way, if you're not subscribed to early warning, we talk about kind of the tactical and operational details of what's going on here. But yeah, Dustin put over in the early warning. And by the way, you can get that at forwardobserver.com/subscribe. And if you want to support the show, definitely do support our mission at Forward Observer, because we are tracking this stuff on a day-to-day basis. Dustin talked about how families of Russian troops who are stationed in Transnistria are being recalled. They're being evacuated, which would be an early warning indicator that, yes, maybe May 9th is the escalation here. Maybe May 9th is when Russia and Belarus deploy additional forces into Ukraine to expand the war effort. I don't know for a fact. That's more Dustin's domain anyway. So he's going to be covering that stuff on over at Forward Observer. All right. Any other questions? Let's see here. It seems like this dovetails with the Primakov doctrine, perhaps a dive. Yeah, I'm not familiar with this doctrine. I really don't know what it is, but I'll Google it later. Next question. Let's see. Are there any? I think there was another question. Did you see where Zelensky was asked by Dutch Party about where his $880 million in assets and account money came from? No, I didn't see that, but yeah, I don't see how you can go from a struggling actor / comedian to the Ukrainian president be almost worth $1 billion. It's just very difficult for me to see, other than Ukraine is a country used for lots of money laundering for the West. It's one reason why the West feels like they have to defend Ukraine. It's kind of a gray zone of finance, because the country's so corrupt, so massively corrupt. That maybe is the only reason why they actually have not joined NATO's, because the place is just too damn corrupt. So I didn't see that, but I'm glad somebody's asking him about it. And I also haven't looked into it, but it's just difficult for me to see how someone like that in just a few short years can be worth $880 million. Chris says Dugan is arguing from a communist lens. He essentially presents two tyrannical types of regimes against each other. Well, look, I'm not a Dugan scholar, as I said yesterday, but let me tell you, in this book, Dugan is not pro-communist in this book. He talks about communism is too collectivized, and he talks about the tragedy of Soviet communism and how difficult that was for the Russian people. So unless I understand your comment, I just don't get the sentiment that Dugan is pro-communist. I don't think he is. He certainly doesn't state that. He states the exact opposite in the book. It's hard to argue against what Dugan is saying. I hate globalists more than I love America. Yeah, Dugan completely reframes this. He completely reframes the view on globalists, and I think he actually does make a very solid argument that the people pushing for globalism in the world right now, they're all in the West. And at the point you're defending the West, you're also defending globalism. What drone should I buy for local intel gathering? Well, it kind of depends on what your resources are and what your mission is. You should Always consider what your mission requirements are, what your collection requirements are before you go invest in something like a drone, like the DJI Mini. Um, my concerns with DJI aside, the Mini, there are several types of. I think DJI has the best commercial drone out on the market. I've bought several smaller drones to try out. Nothing even comes close to a DJI. Apparently, it does share information back with Chinese servers. So, I don't love that. I've heard that there are ways that you can get around that, i.e., like, not connecting your stuff to the internet. I don't know if it works or not. But listen, it kind of depends on what your mission is. Are you going to be, do you need nighttime capabilities? Like what area are you trying to look at? Because that's really going to determine what type of drone you need to get. If it's just for your little, if it's for the back 40 or your little, homestead, yeah, maybe a DJI Mini could work. If you're trying to, look at 1,000 acres, 1,500 acres, a lot larger area, well, you're going to need a larger drone, or you're just going to need a lot of batteries and go run that thing back and forth. Also on the topic of batteries, I have no idea how to repair these things, but spare parts is becoming a huge issue in everything. So I would say if you do buy a drone, figure out how to fix it, because spare parts coming from China is going to be a major pain point for you at the point that it does break. So I don't know, maybe get some more, some parts or components kits or whatever they sell. I don't even know what they sell. But I hope that answers your question. Dustin, let's see. How many high-profile Democrats had sons working for Ukrainian companies? Several. And it's not just Democrats. I believe, don't quote me on this, but I saw somewhere where one of Mitt Romney's sons was also had some ties to some Ukrainian company. So it looks like it was not only Democrats, but yeah, several of them did for sure. I don't like DJI geofencing though. Can you jailbreak them? I have no idea what you can do. The person to ask is Dan. And maybe Dan and I can have a discussion on drones, as a matter of fact, because I think he's starting a new business now where he's focusing on drones. So that'd be good to have him back on to talk about that stuff. But I say Romney, Mitt Romney is barely a Republican. He's just got an R behind his name. Let's see. All right. Well, gang, if there are no other questions about The Great Awakening, this has been a very interesting book. It makes me want to read more of Alexander Dugan. People say that the guy's crazy. He's like a whack job or whatever they say. I didn't get that from this book. I can see how people believe that. And again, this is my only real, other than watching a few videos of Dugan, reading this book's my only real exposure to him. All right. Well, listen, gang, thanks for being a part of this show. I'm going to continue to look at the strategic situation, look at how the world's changing, and figure out ways that we can prepare specifically at the community level. My fundamental advice remains the same. Do your area study and start a preparedness network. Start with friends and families. Have them invite their friends or coworkers, colleagues, acquaintances. Maybe start recruiting at local churches or volunteer organizations. There are a lot of people out there who are very concerned about the future. They may not see themselves as a quote unquote prepper. They may be like me. I don't even like the term prepper. However, that's why I call it a preparedness network. However, there's a lot of people out there who have money, they have assets, they have children, they have wives or girlfriends, they have things they want to protect. They know in the future, all that stuff could be threatened by people who want to take it. So do your area study and start a preparedness network. That's going to set you up that's going to give you a strategic advantage, especially if the worst case happens, or I should maybe when something far worse happens. All right. That's going to do it for today. Everyone, thanks so much. Thanks for being here, and thanks for the support. Remember, please tell your friends and family about the show if you like it, if you're learning something, if you feel empowered, if you feel like you know what's going on, please share the link. And don't forget to like and subscribe. And with that, I'll be back tomorrow at 2 p.m. Central Time. I think Tomorrow we're going to talk about the elite and anti-elite because I didn't talk about that on Monday. So with that, until next time, be well and stay out front.